we go into the second part of today's presentation. Again, remember we'll have a Q&A at the end of this session. A panel Q&A at the end of this session. So if there's other questions, please save them up and we'll be talking about them. But the next stage, we want to go now to the living laboratories. And who led that was two key people, Wendy Miller, who's an associate professor from, I'm getting this wrong, but it's the School of Architecture and Built Environment, and Georgios Kokoginakis, close enough, who's an associate professor at the Sustainable Building Centre at the University of Wollongong. So they were certainly lead in that. But Wendy's going to lead the session here today, and we're also going to have some presentations from people online. So Wendy, thank you.
Thanks, Tony. So today, the Living Labs over the 3 years have done quite a wide range of things. What we're going to focus on today is just the demand response issues that we've been looking at. And why are we looking at demand response markets? One is that's one of our key performance indicators for ARENA. To identify the capacity or reduction is one of our KPIs. But the Living Lab projects as a whole have focused quite strongly on the healthcare sector, so predominantly hospitals and aged care facilities. And theoretically, the healthcare sector has a theoretical demand response capacity that's quite great because all or most healthcare facilities are required by law to have backup generators. But how much of that generation capacity can actually be part of a demand response thing is something that we wanted to investigate a bit, because many people in the healthcare sector treat demand response as either a non-issue or a very scary issue, that it can't be possible or it'll stop our hospitals working. So that's something so we want to present today some issues regarding what are the demand response markets that are possible, and then two case studies, one of a hospital and one of an aged care centre, on how those facilities could theoretically have participated in the demand response. So our agenda, as I just said, is the participation options, then a Queensland hospital and an aged care centre. And our first speaker is Alex Murphy from Stantec, and he's presenting online. So I'm going to hand over to Alex now to start the presentation.
Thanks, Wendy. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. So in my presentation today, I'm firstly going to cover the different types of demand response markets, and then after that, we'll go over a case study using an example hospital in Queensland. So there are multiple opportunities for sites with either behind the meter generation or the ability to load shed to participate in different demand response or DR markets to generate revenue or cost savings. These will be discussed from the simplest to participate in to the more complicated ones based on the infrastructure requirements, applications, and registration requirements needed. Next slide, please. The first demand response option is targeting distributed network service provider or DNSP demand charges. So this does not require you to engage with a retailer, a third-party aggregator, or any registration with AEMO. The DNSP is the local network provider who owns and maintains the poles and wires which provide electricity to your site. And any site with pass-through demand charges from the DNSP, which is typically an unbundled electricity contract, can reduce these costs by reducing the site's demand from the electricity network during peak events. So an example of one of those contracts is shown here, where the retailer, environmental network, market operator, and metering charges are separately billed. So the network charges are typically charged per month on the site's highest peak 30-minute interval during the billable month. And from this example, you can see that highlighted in orange here, the peak demand was 877 kVA with a total demand charge of around $9,600, so about 15% of the total monthly bill. So these network charges vary in price and type across the different electricity providers in Australia. So you will need to review your local network tariff for your particular site if this is of interest. Next slide, please. So here's an example of how a site can target these DNSP charges. So the blue area is a site's electricity consumption from the electricity network during a particular day. And this is the sum of all the electricity usage across the site, so such as lighting, air conditioning, appliances, IT systems, and this varies across the day. Between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. on this example day, which is shown by the area above the black dotted line, there's a peak site event that occurred. As the network demand tariff charges us for the peak demand over the month, in order for us to save on this charge, we need to ensure that this demand never exceeds this predetermined limit. So based on the bill we just reviewed, if we set that maximum limit to 800 kVA, anytime we get close to this limit, we either want to load shed or start a generator to ensure that we don't exceed it. And if we manage to achieve this, then our maximum monthly network charge will never exceed this limit, resulting in DNSP demand charge savings. Next slide, please. The second type of demand response option is targeting the national electricity market, or NEM, high spot price events, which requires you to engage with your retailer and have a demand response agreement in place. So I'll first give an explanation of the wholesale market or spot market to understand how demand response can generate revenue for a customer. Next slide, thanks. So firstly, on the left here, we start off with generators such as power stations, wind farms, solar farms, which generate electricity for consumers. The generators bid electricity into the wholesale market, and AEMO, who is the market operator, dispatches the cheapest combination of generators to match the demand. Retailers, who are on the right side here, then buy electricity from the wholesale market and resell it to households and businesses through retail contracts, which are typically peak and off-peak tariffs. So the difference between the retailer buy and the sell price is their profit or loss during each trading interval. Next slide, thanks. So under normal supply conditions, a retailer might buy from the wholesale market at, say, $50 per megawatt hour and sell to the customer at $150 per megawatt hour, resulting in a profit for the retailer. However, during peak events, when the wholesale market price surges, such as up to $15,000 per megawatt hour, the retail still sells to the customer at $150 per megawatt hour, which would result in a loss for the retailer. So if the customer did participate in demand response during these high spot price events, this would reduce the cost their retailer would pay for electricity during these periods from the wholesale market. However, as seen from these examples, this will not actually reduce the customer's cost of electricity, as they pay the agreed electricity rates as per their retail supply contract. So in order for customers to receive compensation for this type of demand response participation, a demand response agreement must be arranged between the retailer and the customer to share in the wholesale savings. Next slide, thanks. So to determine whether it's worth participating in this type of market, we can review some historical NEM spot price data to see how often these high price events actually occur. So in the first table here, you can see the historical NEM spot price data for Queensland from 2017 to 2021. And you can see in 2017 and 2021 had significantly higher peak prices compared to 18, 19 and 20, as well as a higher average price. The second table here shows the percentage of time the spot price was between particular ranges. So you can see that 97% of all trading intervals had a price between $0 per megawatt hour and $400 per megawatt hour, and only a very small percentage of intervals were greater than $400 per megawatt hour. So if a customer is targeting high spot price events, such as over $400 per megawatt hour, they do not need to participate for many hours each year to benefit from this type of demand response. Next slide, please. An example of high spot price events which occurred between the 11th and 15th of January in 2017 in Queensland is shown in this graph here, which was the result of hot weather causing peak demand on the Queensland network. So in a demand response agreement, there'll be a trigger price which is set, which is the price that the spot price must exceed for demand response to occur. This is typically set to cover the price of running a generator, such as $400 per megawatt hour, and all the spikes above this are demand response opportunities. All demand response agreements are different, but typically the payment to the customer would be a share of the wholesale price, savings, or a fixed payment each month. Next slide, thanks. An example of how the wholesale savings are shared is shown here. So if we have a demand response agreement where the trigger price is $400 per megawatt hour, a 50-50 revenue split between the customer and the retailer, and a high price event of 2,000 megawatt hours, the retailer spot market earnings would be the spot price minus the trigger price. The customer dispatch payment would be the trigger price plus the retailer earnings times the revenue split. And then the customer's net position is the customer's dispatch payment minus the generator run price. And in this example, it's assumed to be the same as the trigger price. So from the $2,000 per megawatt hour event, the customer profit is $800 per megawatt hour under this agreement. So some other key considerations in a demand response agreement beyond the trigger price and the revenue split would be whether participation is mandatory or optional. So for mandatory participation, the retailer would typically have access to control the generators or load shed. They can do that when they like. And for optional, the retailer would send notifications for higher price events to the customer, and then they can choose whether they want to participate or not. And then the other one would be the hours of operation each year. So for example, the retailer might have up to 150 hours per year to be able to participate in these types of events. It is also worth noting that not all retailers offer this type of demand response agreement. So it could be a recommendation to inquire with your retailer before signing a new contract as to whether you can participate in demand response or not. Next slide, please. And the final demand response options are a little bit more complicated as they require you to register with AEMO or engage with a third-party aggregator. So the first is the Wholesale Demand Response Mechanism, or WDRM, which allows third-party aggregators to bid demand response into the wholesale market, and they must respond to dispatch instructions from AEMO like any other generator selling power into the market. The revenue share between the customer and the third-party aggregator will need to be agreed on. However, it's often a fixed payment per year or a split of the actual WDR revenue, such as 50-50. Currently, there are very few customers participating in the WDRM, as it was only introduced in October 2021. The next one is the Reliability and Emergency Reserve Trader, or RERT, which is the electricity market's emergency reserve, which can be called upon by AEMO during extreme events where it is deemed that there's no market resolution to resolve a forecast reliability or security issue on the network. AEMO maintains a panel of RERT providers that can provide reserve if required. However, there's no payments for just being on the RERT panel. And then the last one is the Frequency Control and Auxiliary Services, or FCAS market, which is part of the ancillary services that AEMO use to maintain the network's frequency within the normal operating band by either altering the generation or demand to maintain the balance of supply and demand on the network. Next slide, please. So AEMO operates 8 separate markets for the delivery of FCAS, These include the regulation markets, which responds to minor deviations in frequency, and the contingency markets, which respond to major events such as loss of generators or large transmission components. So raise means raising of the frequency, and lower means lowering of the frequency. Demand response can participate in the FCAS raise markets, as these services raise the network's frequency by either load shedding or increasing the generation on the network. The type of FCAS markets a site can participate in will depend on how quickly you can respond. For example, how long it takes to turn on and ramp up a generator. And in more recent times, more utility scale battery storage systems have started entering the FCAS markets due to their quick response times. FCAS is slightly different from the wholesale market, as payments are made for generator availability, even if their services are not actually required. FCAS participation does not require a third-party aggregator. However, it is a pretty complex market, and joining with a third-party aggregator is often recommended. The revenue sharing between the customer and the third-party aggregator for FCAS will need to be agreed on. However, it's the same as before, either a fixed payment per year or a split of the actual FCAS revenue. Next slide, thanks. So for this next section of the presentation, I'll discuss the case study that was conducted using a major Southeast Queensland hospital to demonstrate the potential economic benefits of demand response using existing diesel generators. However, before we review these results, it's worth noting a couple of things. First, that the network charges are specific to this site, and the spot market and FCAS markets are also specific to Queensland. So while the methodology can be applied to other sites, the outcomes may be very different. The estimated earnings are based on historical load and historical price data and may not actually reflect future loads and earnings. And it's assumed that there's no network connection limitations on the generators, so they can continuously parallel with the network, as well as there's no export limits too. Next slide, thanks. So 3 years worth of electricity meter interval data from 2017 to 2019 was provided to be used in the case study. And you can observe here that the monthly loads are very consistent across this period. Synthetic meter data was also created for the 2020 and 2021 years based off that existing data to allow us to model the potential revenue of demand response in these years using the historical pricing data. And in the case study, we modeled 3 demand response scenarios. So the first one was targeting DNSP network demand charges. The second one was targeting NEM high spot price events. And the third one was targeting FCAS. Next slide, thanks. The first of the demand response participation was targeting DNSP network demand charges. And here were the key modelling assumptions shown in this first table here. So the size of the generator, which is 2,400 kilowatts, the generator run cost, the minimum run capacity of the generator to ensure that it's not underloaded. We assumed a network tariff for the site, and we set a maximum demand of 4,500, which would be the point where the generators would turn on to make sure that we don't exceed that. And then in the second table here, we can see the historical maximum demand for this particular site. And you can see that we're trying to reduce the demand by between about 200 kilowatts and 500 kilowatts, depending on the year. Next slide, thanks. The results of the modelled 5 years are shown here. So the best year was in 2017, which is highlighted in blue there. And in 2017, the generators needed to run for 18 hours to keep the site's maximum demand no greater than 4,500 kilowatts. And this resulted in an estimated demand charge savings of approximately 13,500 and a generator run cost of 6,000. So this led to a customer net position of about $7,700. On the other hand, 2021 was the worst year, which is highlighted in orange there. And during this year, the network demand charges had significantly fallen from the 2017 rates, which caused less savings and an overall negative customer position. And the results of this type of participation shows how a positive position can quickly change to a negative position without some kind of revised strategy on that maximum demand limit. So one of the main issues with targeting these demand charges is not underloading the generators. So you often have to run them at higher outputs than the demand reduction you actually need. So this type of demand response can work a lot better with smaller generators rather than larger generators. Next slide, thanks. The second demand response participation was targeting the NEM high spot price events. And here were the key assumptions in this part of the case study. So the first one was the trigger price, which was also the same as the generator run cost at $400 per megawatt hour. The customer retailer revenue splits, that was 50-50. And the participation, which was for all spot price events greater than $400 per megawatt hour. Next slide, thanks. Here are the results for those 5 years. And again, we can review the best year first, which was 2021 in the blue. In this year, the generator responded to spot price events above $400 per megawatt hour on 115 unique days and ran for 106 hours. During these events, the average spot price was $2,459, leading to a net customer position of approximately $262,000 after the 50% split with the retailer. However, in 2009, which was the worst year in orange there, the generator only responded to 2 unique days and ran for a total of 1 hour. This resulted in a net customer position of $2,800 after the 50% split with the retailer. So this demonstrates how volatile the spot market is, and earnings can vary significantly between years. Next slide, thanks. And the final demand response participation was targeting FCAS. So again, here are the key assumptions for the modelling. There was the generator run cost, there was the customer third-party aggregator revenue split of 50-50, and the participation was in the contingency 60-second raise and 5-minute raise markets. So just a reminder that generators are paid to be available to provide FCAS, even if their services are not actually required. So the majority of the time you may not actually be dispatched, and therefore an estimated runtime of 10 minutes a month has been assumed in this case study. Next slide, thanks. And again, here are the 5 years worth of results. As in the previous results, the best year was the blue highlighted one, and this was in 2018. The estimated payments for available generation in the 60-second market was around $115,000 and $285,000 in the 5-minute raise market, which led to a net customer position of $198,000 after the 50% split with the third-party aggregator. And then 2017 was the worst year, which the estimated payments for the 60-second market was about $25,000 and $56,000 in the 5-minute raise market. So this led to a net customer position of $39,000. So again, like in the spot market, this demonstrates how volatile the FCAS market is and how earnings can significantly change between years. Next slide, thanks. Here is a summary of those 3 different markets across those different years and what the total net positions were. So from the case study, participating in NEM high price events and FCAS contingency raise markets presented significant demand response opportunities for the existing generators for this particular site, whereas targeting network charges, not so much. It's also worth noting that demand response participation in different markets is not mutually exclusive. So you can target multiple different types of demand response if your site has the ability to. And that's it for my part for today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. We're going to now hear from University of Wollongong about a aged care facility case study. I'll just note for the hospital case study just presented that the hospital actually has multiple generators, but would theoretically only allow one of their generators to participate in the demand response market because their remaining generators were sufficient to run the hospital in the case of a power blackout, for example. So it was a redundant generator in essence above what their demand was. Thanks.
Good afternoon, folks. My name's Michael Tibbs from the University of Wollongong. So thanks for that introduction, Alex, down in Melbourne. We've been on a similar journey, and it's quite an interesting one through the AEMO markets, and it's been a complementary and contrasting journey to what you've been through. Our aged care facility doesn't have a standby generator set, and so we're looking at using HVAC loads and shutting those down. So just to clarify what we're looking at, so demand response is on the demand side, but it can be with consumer energy resources, as Alex has said. But I'd like to define it as something that's grid interactive control of consumer flexible assets. So it can be fast switching off of loads, or load shifting, or demand flexing, and we'll be looking at a couple of those technologies. Our facility, Shell Cove, is it's a modern facility with 99 kilowatts of PV, and I'd just like to point out that it's one of 9 residential care homes in their portfolio. So there's potential for aggregation sector-wide there. The HVAC system, there's 258 kilowatts of demand response capable, and Dan will come back to this, but I say very carefully capable. It doesn't mean it's plug and play. They've got really good thermal comfort, and just to point out, so we haven't got a major generator set. We're looking at HVAC loads where they can be aggregated. So it is more complex to control HVAC loads rather than just turning a generator on or off. And Alex pointed out, if you turn your generator set fully on, like, it's not at the ideal load, but HVAC loads are constantly going up and down, so there's complexities there for control. So we just asked the question, why would you face the complexity and the risk of demand response for aged care? So if you're an aged care facilities manager or an energy sort of consultant negotiating their energy contracts, why would you go to this sort of complexity where, say, a sustainability manager or a facilities manager, no one really has responsibility to implement demand response. It's just not on anyone's radar. Technically, it's complex. Commercially, it's complex and fraught. Why would you do it? And the risks, I run an aged care facility. I don't run an energy market, a business. I'm not trying to run on the stock market. So why would I do that? So some of the reasons why HVAC is a major cause of the peak demand problem. This is a table from Stephen White's group's work, which is quite colourful and interesting. It shows, if you can see here, the colours represent the outdoor temperature, and on the y-axis is the median network demand. So, and this is for the whole New South Wales network. So when the temperatures are around 22 degrees or something like that, that's the minimum sort of median demand for those sort of periods. When it gets colder or when it gets hotter, the demand goes up, and that's largely due to HVAC. But the thing to note about this in particular is when it gets above 35 degrees, everyone wants to come home and turn their air conditioner on, and it really jumps up. The size of those dots is the proportion of time in those periods. I think, Stephen, that's right, isn't it? And you can see it's several percent in this region, and the size of the grid, the size of the generation capacity of the grid is set by that little period of time there. So HVAC is a part of the problem. Can it be part of the solution? So building, an advantage is that building HVAC loads have inherent energy flexibility. If you ask an air conditioner to run at 22 degrees, it doesn't run at 22 plus 0.1 minus 0.1. It floats up and down. If you can be aware of those timing, you can just play within those bands and shift the timing of loads a little bit if you're smart. And there's thermal mass of buildings, so you don't turn an air conditioner off and it suddenly drops. It just holds temperature. So there's some inherent energy storage in HVAC system that's you don't have to pay for. The technology is ready, and Dan will come back to that later. The world is changing. Just thought of a throwaway line. Maybe one of the major parties could try that as a slogan: status quo. We can't just stick with that anymore. The world is changing. And not only the world, but the energy market is rapidly changing, whether we like it or not. The coal-fired generators are closing down. They can't survive. And I'll just show an example of the spot price here. Where the green line here is the demand over a period of 48 hours, so there's 2 daily cycles there. And you can see as the demand reaches a peak during the day, the purple line is the spot price, so the spot price is fluctuating up and down, but when it gets to a certain level, there's these short, sharp spikes, and that's what we're looking at. And the other side of this is that when demand gets low during the day, when there's a lot of PV generating, the price can actually get negative, so it's minus $100. So generators, the coal-fired generators on the spot price, are having to pay to put power on the grid, which is hurting them. And in a similar way, if you were using a HVAC system during that period there, and you were on a wholesale spot price agreement, you would be paid to use that power in that short time. The other way that the market's changing, it's gone from 30-minute settling to 5-minute trading intervals, and you can see it's just a lot more sporadic, noisy in the short term, but that means the market is able to be more responsive to the needs. So a price isn't set and fixed for half an hour. So the grid, it's changing. It's not like it used to be where you just use the power that you want and the government has to build more coal-fired power stations to meet that need and we just pay for it at a low fixed price. It's just not like that anymore. The grid needs us, we need the grid, and so grid interactive consumers need to understand the grid and understand how to interact with it if you want to get a benefit from that. And the grid sends price signals to incentivise that sort of action. I won't go into the revert and the wholesale demand response. They seemed interesting for us at the start, but they weren't going to work for us. So what we got onto, it was like a eureka moment for us really. The wholesale spot price just seemed simple. It was flexible, technically complex for sure, but the pieces were there. And there's the ability to avoid those short, sharp forecast spikes. There's no bidding on the market, you're just a price taker, so you can make your decision and you just get charged for whatever you use. So it's quite simple. It goes You can go positive or negative, so you can feed in and get paid for that amount, or you can, if you reduce your load for each 5-minute period, when it gets high, you can just save costs on that. And a surprising bonus for us was the FCAS market. We weren't thinking that HVAC would be able to operate on the FCAS sort of timeframes, but they're very short, sharp. They don't have an impact on thermal comfort. They don't happen very often, but you do need to aggregate up to 1 megawatt trading increments. So you would need to aggregate not just multiple sites, but multiple portfolios probably. So I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek at AEMO, and I wish it was called the National Electricity Market Operator. Sounds like a clownfish, but I say that for a reason, because I think of Nemo's dad, Merlin, I think his name is. Don't go past the edge. Don't go past the edge. You've gone past the edge. Don't go touch the boat. And there's a fear. I guess what I'm saying is that this is not just a technical issue. It's not just a market issue. It's not just a finance issue. This is not going to happen. It's just not going to happen if people can't be, you can't hold their hands and just walk them through it. We've had a lot of time to go through this. It's been really difficult to negotiate the markets, the technologies, the sites, and even now we're not ready to go to our trusted research partner who we've been working with closely with for 10 years, and they trust us inherently. We're still not ready to go to them and say, let's give this a go. We're still trialling and demonstrating and working things through. So that's a big market, big comment for us. Are we going to have courage to embrace the adventure like Crush there? And it might be uncomfortable because we don't understand what's going on. So as collective of the aged care sector and HVAC industry and researchers, how are we going to respond to these demands of the marketplace? And it's really going to rely on relationships of trust, understanding the market, but really we see the ongoing work of Living Laboratories as a collaborative green proving ground. But it's actually a safe place to collaborate together, make mistakes, trial things and see how things work. So Dan's just going to continue on from there.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, my name is Daniel Daly from the University of Wollongong. I think that's great scene setting for what I'll present now, which is some of our technology and services evaluation that we've done in the Warragul Living Lab. So I'm going to talk through two technology or service evaluations, one being the exposure to the wholesale spot price market, which really, as Michael said, that was the eureka moment. There's a key enabling service here for HVAC demand response, and then also our bonus there of using demand response enabled HVAC devices for FCAS. So firstly, I'm just going to present the results for the wholesale spot price market testing. Don't worry about all the numbers on that table. That's just there for a bit of visual interest, and everything's in the report. Basically what we were doing was looking at historic data for the Warragul site and comparing what they paid on their typical Tier 1 energy retailer supply contract with what they would have paid on a wholesale spot price offering. So Flow Power have a pure wholesale pass-through offering, which basically charges whatever the wholesale spot price is for that time period, plus a margin. So we looked at the existing retailer costs per month for an 18-month period, and then the wholesale, the Flow Power wholesale spot price offering. The summary of that table, what we found was that with no active demand response, so this is just looking at historic data when there's no demand response enabled, it's a site that's not responding to the wholesale spot price. We're just seeing what would have happened. In theory, you should be better off being exposed to the wholesale spot price on average, because you're the one taking the risk rather than the electricity supplier taking the risk. So in theory, on average, you should be better off on the wholesale spot price. What we found in the period we looked at was that they were almost identical, so $1,000 over 18 months. The wholesale spot price had an awful lot more variability. So in the table, there was months where the electricity bill was $20,000 per month, and then the next month it might be $5,000 for that month. And it's nothing that the site is doing in particular, it's just the change in cost. So most of the time the wholesale spot price was cheaper per month, but then there was a few months where it was quite a lot more expensive. Important to note, there are sort of hedging options that are offered through that, through Flow Plough. So we were looking at just the straight wholesale price. They do have hedging options which don't dilute the wholesale price signal, which could be appropriate. So looking at why, or the period that we looked at, so this is a graph here of the wholesale spot price for a number of years. The red line there is the period that we looked at for the evaluation. And what you can see there is there's a lot more high spikes in the red period. So it just so happened that our evaluation period had a lot of high price events. So considering price events over 1,000 megawatts per hour, which is pretty expensive. In previous years, there was an average of 3.6 hours per year over $1,000 per megawatt hour. In the years that we looked at, or the period we looked at, there was 18.5 hours one year and 33 hours the next year, and that has a big impact on the bill. Now the question is this just a historical anomaly, or is this just the way that the national energy market's moving and the wholesale spot price is going to get more expensive in times and more volatile? So a slight change to that graph, which is the 5-minute data that's occurred since we did the evaluation, and you can see there's still a relatively high number of peak price events. So I think, jury's out on whether we looked at a historically abnormal period or if this is just the way that things are going on the spot price. But safe to say that whichever period we had chosen for our evaluation, it's important to understand the context. Now we get to what was really interesting for us as people who are interested in demand response. So this graph here, I'll just explain it first. So what we have is these black lines being the energy use of 2 condenser units serving the common areas at Warrigal Shell Cove, and then these blue lines being the temperature in those areas. Across here is a time period of a couple of days. Now, looks as though you can't see there were some red shading lines in, but we'll just have to imagine those. So the bottom graph here is at the same time the wholesale spot price on a log scale. So these price events are substantially more expensive. So this is almost $10,000 per megawatt hour, and here's about $1,000 per megawatt hour. So when we looked at the time step data for our analysis, what we really saw was that there was a lot of potential for demand response. So looking at December 2020, which was one of the very expensive months, 42% of the energy cost for that site during that period would have been from 5.5 hours of energy usage when the price was above 500 megawatts, $500 per megawatt. And 12% was for just 1.5 hour period where the price was extremely high. So that's this 1.5 hour period where price went incredibly high. And what we saw when we looked at the concurrent condenser usage was that with no demand response, there was quite a few times when air conditioners were running flat chat at the same time that there was a very high wholesale spot price. So what that tells us is that there's these periods where there's peaking consumption which coincides with a high spot price event. So, excuse me, that's an opportunity there for essentially turning off the air conditioners for that one period. But then there's also this concurrent opportunity to pre-cool the space if you have predictive forecasts. So pre-cooling the space in the morning and then turning the air conditioners off during the high price events. So we did that evaluation and we thought, great, demand response looks really good. Let's just go and enable the demand response on those devices and evaluate that. What we learnt was that demand response capable does not mean demand response ready, and we had an awful lot of challenges in moving from seeing the potential to getting a evaluation going. So we went out to the market with I guess a wish list of the things that we said, well, let's do this, let's do smart building control, let's do adaptive set point control of the the set points within the building. Let's have model predictive control using weather forecasts and wholesale spot price. Let's do all these great things, which we know in the academic literature are going to, do a very good job of saving energy, improving the value of renewable energy. And what we realised was that there's a lot of companies who offer a part of the puzzle, but there's not really a turnkey solution out there that's specific for aged care facilities, specific for that site. There's a lot of complexity in the opportunity. Some companies were able to offer, as I say, parts of the puzzle, but not the but the site wasn't appropriate, or there was a lot of issues there. Substantial site-specific integration issues. So, as I say, demand response capable doesn't mean demand response ready. So, the condenser units that we have were not compliant with the standard, but that didn't mean they couldn't be used. It just meant that there needed to be some additional work ongoing, and then the actual work in terms of getting condenser units talking to grid level metering and all that sort of stuff was relatively substantial. We moved away from set point controls because when we looked into, I guess, the literature on the adaptive thermal comfort set point, we just felt that it was a little bit, may not be appropriate for the aged care setting. There was a bit too much risk there for for us to recommend it to the partner. And one specific issue that was interesting was just metering issues. So you need a very granular meter for participating in the FCAS market. So we needed to get a Modbus connection into the existing meter. We thought that's fine, that's the easiest way to do it. We spoke to the sustainability manager at Warragul. They said, oh, you better talk to the finance guy. He said, oh, you better talk to the guy who negotiates the energy contract. He said, oh, you better talk to the energy retailer. They said, you better talk to the our metering contractor. They said, talk to the metering subcontractor. We thought, okay, let's not do that. Let's let's put our own meter in parallel. Which again, once we did that, we came across a whole another range of problems, which had its own complexity. So I'm still not sure which would have been the better approach there. And the last note, the pandemic constraints. Obviously, that's just a point in time, but. Myself and Michael have still never been inside the residence parts of this aged care facility because it's you're not allowed in for non-essential visits. So what did we actually do? We're looking at demand response, enabling devices controlling air conditioning for the FCAS market, essentially. So working with DNA Energy, and Daniel Barber's in the room if anyone wants to find out what DNA Energy do, because I'm not the best person to tell you about their full suite. Essentially, they have a demand response management switching device that can work with non-compliant HVAC devices, so devices that don't comply with the demand response standard. And basically, we were looking at two things. We were looking at can we participate in, or which FCAS markets can we participate in? Essentially, can we participate in the 6-second market? So is the response time fast enough? And then what's the potential value for the site? So the installation, as I say, talk to Daniel if you want to know the details, but essentially there's a smart integrated device at each condenser unit which talks to a grid level high granularity meter. And that's essentially what we're talking about in terms of tech. There's a lot of smarts that go behind that, but that's essentially the installation. So this is all hot off the press, I guess, fresh out of the oven. We've just been doing this testing in the last few weeks, but the early response are promising. So we're testing for DRM1, which means turn the condenser unit off, basically. The graphs across the bottom are showing the load for a single condenser unit, and they're just the same graph, but just zoomed in on one demand response event. And the red vertical line there is the point in time when the demand response call was made. Basically, what we need to see is, does that demand response reliably get to zero within 6 seconds of the call being made? What we're seeing at the moment is that it's pretty promising. It's taking about 4 seconds on average. And it's happened, every time we've seen so far is under 6 seconds. So it's looking as though we can participate in the 6-second market. And that's particularly important because that's where most of the value is in FCAS. The faster you can respond, the more value there is in FCAS. So if we can respond to the 6-second market, it makes it much more attractive as a proposition. So again, fresh out of the oven, these results. So looking at what the value to Warragul could be, and this is sort of a whole envelope value of what they could get out of participating in the FCAS market. We're evaluating 100 kilowatts of their 260 kilowatts of DR capable systems. So we looked at historic FCAS prices during our living laboratory monitoring period and align that with the concurrent condenser usage. And what we see is two things. One, there's a fair chunk of money there. It's pretty attractive as a proposition, but it's incredibly variable, as Alex was pointing out in his presentation. So some months there, we're looking at potentially around $10,000 for Warragul for that month, and then other months it's less than $100. And I guess the other point to note is we've spoken to a lot of people in the industry, and as Michael said, it's been quite a journey understanding these markets. And we can't get a clear answer on what the trajectory for FCAS is. Some people are saying, batteries are going to eat all the value out of the FCAS market, and other people are saying, no, more renewables in the market means more need for FCAS, so the value is going to increase. So I guess this is a point in time, and you can see it's already highly variable. So what's next? I think it's somewhat of a shame that I'm presenting now at the iHub Outcomes Summit, because I think we've been on this long journey with our living lab provider, and we're sort of getting to the a really good understanding of what their value propositions are and how they can participate in demand response, and who's out there who can do the work, and what's next, I guess, for that place. The NEM's changing rapidly. It's quite hard to understand, but there are some rewarding opportunities out there for people who make use of them, who interact with the grid. Each piece of the puzzle is available, but I think that the bit's missing there is that each piece of the puzzle is available, but each piece of the puzzle is puzzling, and it takes a long time to understand what, if it's appropriate for your site and how you would best access it. And again, just reiterating Michael's point that the living laboratory is, it's an ideal space for understanding this value. We sort of see, putting it all together, that back to what our original wish list. I think now we understand a little bit better what the various values are. So the FCAS market, essentially, if you can meet that 6 second raise market, and they're shortly introducing a very fast raise market, so that'll be 1 or 2 seconds, and if you can turn off your air conditioning quickly, there's a lot of value in the market, and once you understand it, it's probably pretty easy to access that value. In terms of temperature set point flexing, which is probably something that we were thinking is the eureka, and that's the bigger picture long term. It's also the more complex picture, and there's a few more pieces in the puzzle that need to be probably further research. So understanding what the appropriate set points for the aged care setting is, understanding in detail the building thermodynamics, so how long can we turn the air conditioner off for in that space before we're risking discomfort. And model predictive control, I think, is the key enabler there. And again, it's really complex. It's a socio-technical issue. I'm putting myself in the shoes of a building owner or a sustainability manager working at Warragul. I care about keeping my patients safe. There's just no way that even with us working with them this whole time, it's so far down the list of their issues that without turnkey solutions or really trusted intermediaries, it's just not going to happen at the moment. And that's the lot for me. So Wendy, back to you. Thanks.
So we might actually be a bit short on question time, but I'm happy to answer a question later. Take one? Yeah, sure.
Actually, to the speaker, I was wondering, not knowing the market very well, how do you demonstrate the savings against a provider? Do you need a counterfactual baseline?
Can you just speak in, so that people
so
online
the
can
savings we just saw, right, that can be on the order of $35,000, those are savings against an operation where you didn't implement the FCAS control, right?
Savings is probably the wrong word. So you get paid for having capacity available for the FCAS market. So whether or not it's used, you would still get paid for the capacity. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. In this case, the frequency control is just to shed load, not to add, right?
That's right, just the shed load, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I might just add to that that as part of the work we're doing with Stantec, we interviewed a number of hospital providers in Queensland who actually participate in the market, and what struck me was two different approaches. So there was one sustainability manager of a hospital who's said, my job is to run the hospital and save patients, but I'm interested in the market. So their solution is that they have a supplier who supplies the generators to the hospital, maintains the generators, and participates in the market, and just pays the hospital for that. So a combined services sort of approach, and for that manager that was a really good thing. So the hospital, so he as the facilities manager in essence gets paid a monthly fee for their aggregator to play in the market. He doesn't care how the aggregator plays and whether he's doing spot price stuff or FCAS or anything, doesn't care. He just gets a set amount of money into his budget every month. Win-win sort of thing. On the other hand, on the other side of that, we spoke to a sustainability manager for a suite of healthcare facilities in regional Queensland, and he had 3 different contracts, so with a retailer for spot price stuff, with their DNSP regarding that market, and with an aggregator for, so those 2 were with the main hospital, their biggest hospital in their suite, and then with an aggregator who had control of all the smaller generators of 6 or 7 smaller distributed health centres throughout regional Queensland, and they were playing on the spot market of higher trigger price for those smaller centres with smaller generators. But that particular person was really interested in the NEM market, liked understanding what was going on, liked engaging with the different parties for the different contractors, and felt that that was how he was value adding to the job. So I think we might leave it there, and I'll pass back to you, Tony.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Wendy, and the panel of people who presented. Very insightful.